Battersea Park, and I think this is a fascinating place to think about the topic of infrastructure. We're about to enter quite a serious recession, so today the Bank of England predicted it would be a sort of 14% drop in GDP, and that it won't a big increase in unemployment, and things won't really get back to where they were for about 2 years. One of the things you have to do in a recession is spend money on infrastructure, because this is an investment that it provides long-term returns, and it's money wisely spent. Now, if you think something like Battersea Park, you don't really think of this as an infrastructure project, but it was built in the 19th century on what had been marshland, and the idea was to create an enormous public space for what was quite a working class area, possibly with sort of health problems and diseases and other things. So this was very much at the time, along with other similar projects, a big public health scheme, but also a piece of public infrastructure. Now, interestingly, it was built using soil that had been dug out from East London, where docks were being built. So obviously that's a commercial enterprise, and also around the outside of the park there are various big grand houses built, and there were plans to even build big grand houses within the park itself. So it was very much a kind of public-private venture in the kind of model that we're used to seeing in parts of London today. So the idea effectively that these other commercial activities would therefore fund a public endeavour, which was supported with an Act of Parliament that allowed the actual park to be built and kept in perpetuity. So the difference is now people still build little parks with property developments, but they're tiny and they're not really that great. And this is epic, and it far outstrips the size of any kind of property speculation that happened around the edges. So possibly we need to think massively about public infrastructure now, but we also need to look at some of the way we balanced it out, and think we might have to lean more in the favour of the public health and those other long-term benefits, rather than the short-term benefit of building some property and selling it quickly and making loads of money. That is because this crisis is a public health crisis, but it's also a crisis of poverty. It's people who are poorer, and people who are in precarious work, and people who are in low-paid public-facing roles who are more likely to get this disease and die from it. And in order to build a sustainable societies and cities that can respond flexibly and be resilient to problems like this, we need to massively think about how to design a city around the idea that people there will not be as many of these diseases of poverty, because the public spaces exist which are there for everybody to have a high quality of life and live safely. So interesting thoughts, we'll keep exploring. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my show. It's Merlin Fulcher. This is the Thursday the 7th of May. I just want to apologise, I've been away for a bit. I was completely knocked out by hay fever and just needed some good time to relax and recover from it. You can probably hear I still sound a bit blocked up, but I really appreciate everybody who's subscribed to the channel. We now have 21 subscribers, it's amazing, and do send in your comments on what I'm covering, let me know your thoughts. So this evening I just wanted to talk about two really big themes that are coming up. We're coming towards what could be the sort of the beginning of the end of the lockdown, certainly not the beginning of the end of this bizarre crisis. But the two topics that are really big right now in my mind are procurement and also infrastructure. And both of them are quite weird words which seem quite dry, but they're actually really simple. And the big problem with both of them is this idea that you can get through both of these problems by spending as little money as possible, and that is completely wrong, because what you need to do is get through these problems by using as much thinking and as much design as possible, and to sort of set aside that initial money factor to think in the long term. Now, the reason I think this evening everybody needs to look at this particular story, the reason I'm mentioning it right at the beginning of the show, so this is just a slide and it's an excerpt from the Channel 4 News this evening. Channel 4 News has done an absolutely fantastic investigation into the scandal of PPE, which is this equipment, this protective equipment for doctors and nurses and healthcare workers. And basically the government, in this picture you can see a giant warehouse, and in the warehouses like this the government had millions and millions of masks and gowns and ventilators and syringes and all this kind of stuff. And as part of the sort of sensible management of any state, you prepare for disasters. And so in a place like this, they stock loads and loads of equipment in case there was an influenza outbreak. Totally rational stuff to do, but it turns out we found this through the Channel 4 News investigation, that these warehouses were full of the stuff, but the stuff was out of date. And that meant that when it came to this sudden crisis, which the government wasn't expecting to happen, and was much worse than they were expecting to happen, they couldn't get the equipment out there fast enough because not all of this equipment could be proven to be safe. And they have gone through various processes to sort of validate it, so you can show that old gear is okay for doctors and nurses to use, but it took some time, and that caused real problems. And we're seeing in the statistics, sadly, that a lot of the new cases now are people working in the healthcare profession, NHS workers, doctors, nurses. So sadly, when we look back at this time and we see people who were ill, people who were damaged by this illness, and people who died as a result of this illness, this failure of the government to properly look after these stockpiles probably will be something that's discussed at length in the inquiries. And it looks like this is a failure that's really emerged over the last 10 years. And over the last 10 years in Britain, we've had this programme of austerity, which was about saving money. People voted for this. I didn't agree with it, but it's the route we went down. But there are things you can save money on and things you really, really shouldn't save money on. And I think a lot of people would agree this is not an area you should try to save money on. Now, I think the procurement is a big issue, and I think this also relates to a few other things. Now, this morning, the Bank of England published a whole load of data about what it thinks our economy is doing now, and also what it thinks our economy is going to do in the future. And I've chosen this slide to show because this is a kind of illustrative scenario, and you can see that it shows that in 2020, the economy goes off a kind of cliff, and then there's a recovery. And if you look closely at this graph, that recovery is towards the end of 2021. So we're at May 2020, so that is a good 18 months away that we have quite a steep recovery according to the Bank of England. And then things on that nice little green dotted line appear to sort of recover to where they would like them to be. So they're saying there's going to be a 14% drop in GDP, which is how we measure economic activity, and a doubling of unemployment. This is extraordinary, and the data suggests that nothing like this has ever happened in the 300 years of data like this being gathered. So this is major, this is seismic, and hopefully because of our ingenuity, because of the amazing discussions we're having, we're actually going to deal with this in a positive way, which isn't going to punish the poorest in society, and but there's a lot of risk that we don't go down that route. But generally, lots of things potentially suffer in a downturn. Certainly the poorest suffer the most, the richest tend not to. But what's generally accepted is that one way of mitigating the horrific impacts of downturns like this is to invest in infrastructure. And we know that throughout the developed world there is a massive shortfall in the amount of money that goes into infrastructure generally. We've been lucky in that there have been some good infrastructure investment projects such as Crossrail 2, HS2 and others in the UK, and what we really need to see in this very difficult time is investment in infrastructure, but also intelligent investment in infrastructure, and investment in infrastructure which addresses the fact that the big problem with this disease is that it affects people who are poor and people who are in low paid jobs working in public facing roles. Now I wanted to just show some really great research that has been done by Centre for Cities. This is a report recently published, and what it does is they're trying to look at density. Now some people, when they come across a problem like this crisis, this coronavirus crisis, they would say, well, the problem is a problem to do with density. So it's dense cities where lots of people are close together and that's making this disease spread. Now that is wrong, and this data shows it. So yes, it is true that in dense environments, like for example the London Underground and public transport, the disease will spread more. But the reality is that the correlation, the data shows that it's people who are more, who are poorer, who have less access to high quality health infrastructure and other public infrastructure, and also people with who are in these jobs, these public-facing dangerous roles, who are more likely to suffer these diseases. And what you can see also from this data here, effectively the green dots which are closer to where my head is are the areas where are dense that have had more virus outbreaks: Southwark, Lambeth, Westminster, Kensington, Chelsea, Islington, Wandsworth. These are all areas which suffer from a lot of poverty. Now you have to remember, London, people think of London as a city of wealth, but a third of the people in London live in absolute poverty. This is sadly one of the poorest cities in Britain. And so these particular points, these places, yes, Kensington, Chelsea is one of the wealthiest places in the country, but it also has massive poverty. And a lot of the people who work in Kensington and Chelsea who are in poverty are working in these extremely low-paid, precarious jobs where they're at risk of this disease. There are other parts of the country which are denser than London. For example, Portsmouth. Portsmouth, if we look here, it's way down towards the other side in the left. And luckily in Portsmouth, people, it would appear, aren't suffering the same risks. So this really, it cannot be stressed more. This is not a disease of density. This is not a disease of cities. This is something which is linked to poverty. And when we think about how we invest in infrastructure, and how we spend our money wisely on infrastructure, and how we spend our money wisely on procurement, we need to always really realise that the stability and strength and resilience of a society will depend on tackling poverty. And that is something which people really embraced with gusto in the beginning of the 20th century, when there were other major disease outbreaks, when slums were a real thing in our cities. And we got through this because we took this stuff extremely seriously. We have this capacity as a society, as human beings. We can do this, but we need to take it seriously, and we need political willpower to make this happen, right? Now, all over the world, a lot of people are talking about redesigning our cities to make them better for pedestrians and cyclists, and this makes perfect sense. In London, it doesn't really look like it's going to be possible for as many people to ride the underground that could in the past. Your average tube train at full capacity has 1,000 people on it, and some of the lines, like Victoria Line, have a train nearly every minute. There are hundreds of thousands of people who use the London Underground normally every day, and we think that's going to have to be in the tens of thousands if you're going to want to have 2 meters between each person. And then that means a lot of people are going to have to cycle, a lot of people are going to have to walk. The Mayor of London is anticipating 10 times more people cycling. That could be really fun. It could be really beautiful if the roads are safe and decent. Or it could be really difficult, because, to be honest, cycling can be pretty athletic, cycling around London. There are hills, there are long distances. This is quite a spread out city. So a lot of thought needs to go into it. Now, I want to talk about infrastructure. So what happened today is there was a big announcement. It's called London Street Scene, and it's effectively a major programme by the Mayor of London to improve our infrastructure. Now, we've kind of been here before, and with a different mayor though, but we had these things called cycle superhighways, and it was a really nice idea to make cycling more visible, but there was criticism at the time that some of these cycle superhighways were effectively just a bit of paint thrown on the floor, right? And this is my picture, it's a bit of a blurry picture, but I think this does kind of illustrate the experience of being on a cycle superhighway sometimes. So you can see that it's effectively just a big cycle lane in bright blue. There's no continuous white line between the cycle lane and the road, and the car section of the road, and that effectively means that as a car driver, it's totally legit just to go in that blue space whenever you feel like it. If it had a continuous white line, that means you're prohibited from ever going in there, and if it's a dotted white line, it means you can go in there under certain exceptions. If there's no white line, it's effectively fair game. So this road user is totally within their rights to drive in that blue section, and then this bicycle user, sadly, he's had to go on the pavement, and that's going to cause kind of problems for pedestrians and people with buggies, and this is just like a total fail of a situation. It's dangerous for everybody. It really isn't good, and it's because sadly it's basically because they wanted to get results, but they didn't want to spend too much money. And this is not the way we need to approach our cities, especially now, because we know so much is at stake, as I've just described. So what we need is really, really, really well designed new infrastructure, which creates a certain amount of space for valid vehicle use. That's important, not silly vehicle use.
really, really great space for cyclists so they can use this space properly, and really, really great space for pedestrians. And this can't be a thing where people think somebody's gained at anybody else's expense. Yeah, everybody, all users of these spaces need to gain together, and that means having a really strong design-led approach with people who really think about this stuff. And and yes, this is an emergency and things have to be done quickly. Absolutely, right? But we have a really amazing design community in London, and there are people who can think quickly, and people who've been thinking about this for years anyway. But you need to talk to the right people. We don't want more cycle lanes like this. You know, we cannot come out of this crisis with failed infrastructure. Uh, so here's a picture. I just wanted to show this slide. This is an example of a bit of infrastructure which you could possibly say maybe they went a bit too far the other way. There was a lot of money spent on this. I think it was tens of millions of pounds. This is Exhibition Road. This is a major sort of cultural centre in London. It's where the V&A is, where the Science Museum, Natural History Museum. People come from all over the world to enjoy this place. And it was a bit of a disaster before, cars just racing down, taxi drivers, whatever. And the idea was to create a space which was good for pedestrians, good for cyclists, and yes, cars could also get through it. And it's very design led, and it's very much respectful to the extraordinary character of this street and its kind of international, but also national and local significance. This project took absolutely years to deliver, and it involved some excellent architects, Dixon Jones, who've done really good work all over London. And I think the thing is basically what I would say is we probably can't expect the same kind of quality of transformation all over London, but what we should do is look at the process behind this, look at the fact that it was design led, and say we should aspire to a similar level of thinking, even if we can't aspire to a similar level of funds being spent on it. But we really need to say that all public spaces, all town centres, right out to outer London zones, right to the very centre, this needs to bring together all parts of London and say we're going to have the same kind of attention to detail. And then what I say is fundamentally draw on that design talent. Now, I've been in a conversation with a friend, Chris Williamson, who runs a firm called Weston Williamson and Partners. He's based in Waterloo, and we've been chatting by email, and he's trying to think about how he can bring his team back into the office in a kind of safe and sustainable way. Weston Williamson have done decades of work with Transport for London and the Mayor of London, basically improving London, working on all kinds of London Underground projects and other things. So they really know what they're talking about. And in these slides, effectively, I mean, obviously this is hypothetical, but they're looking at things like massive priority for cycling. His suggestion is that really cycle hire, electric cycles, electric scooters, all of this stuff needs to be free. But also we need a phased use of public spaces. So we need to have timed access to the city. We need to have certain hours where private cars are just really not permitted. The whole streets need to be given over to bicycles and to other sustainable forms of transport. But also when it comes to that heavy infrastructure trains, we need to look at them and think, can we book slots into the trains? But can we also say that certain stations are access only and certain stations are exit only, to really ensure that there's no kind of clash between people. And this is pretty bold thinking, but this has come from somebody who's done this work for decades and really knows this infrastructure because basically they designed it. So this is really, really good thinking. And this is the kind of thinking we actually need to bring out and make into a discussion for all Londoners, because for example, this big press release that went out from the Mayor of London today about the street scene project, it didn't have any visuals. So they talked about turning Euston Road into a much bigger cycle lane, but there were no visuals showing what it would look like. And I talk to architects all the time. I know that we have huge resources, both professional and with many decades of experience, but also people at the beginning of their careers with a lot of enthusiasm. So it kind of saddens me that we're not having a big public discussion which is visually led, which is about what we want our city to look and feel like in the future. And that needs to be a discussion that involves everybody, because we are going to build a city where people are not working in precarious situations, where people do not feel like they're a lesser citizen because of the nature of the work they do. We know as a result of this crisis that it is the people doing that most dangerous and unpaid work who are the most important people in our society, and we need to cherish those people, respect those people, and pay them more, but also design a city that is safe for them to use and safe for everybody else to use, that we can celebrate and create a truly sustainable global city. I know it's a cliche, but I'm saying it. And I think that is even more important today, because today is Thursday the 7th of May, tomorrow is Friday the 8th of May, and that is, and very unusual in Britain, a Friday bank holiday, because we are going to mark the VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, 75 years from today. And you know, a lot of memorials get built, and there are physical ones, and there are also calendar ones and cultural ones. I think it's important with things like this to mark these things by doing research, and I'm going to be doing some research on it. But I think also we need to learn from these lessons and to make sure that certain things never happen again, but also that we create societies which are progressive and forward-looking as a result of it. So I strongly feel that on this VE Day, if we are to learn anything from the sacrifices that were made then, and these enormous sacrifices being made now, we need to say, look, no more of this precarious, low-paid public sector work. You know, we need to pay people properly, and we need to respect the kind of commitment, sacrifice that's being made by people in these dangerous roles. That's how we move forward. Thank you for listening. I'm going to be back with more soon. Do subscribe if you've enjoyed it. Comment, send me your ideas for things you'd like me to cover. I'm going to close out with a video of me discussing this very theme. Thank you for
Sea Park, and about to go home. And behind me, you can see there's a sort of war memorial, and that, I guess, was built to commemorate the First and Second World Wars. And Friday, tomorrow, is the VE Day bank holiday, so that's to commemorate 75 years since the Victory in Europe Day. And obviously that was a kind of moment of great public sacrifice in countries all over the world. Lots of people died, very tragic things happened, which was then memorialised with these kind of objects like this. And obviously we're not exactly living through the best of times now either, so it kind of begs that question about how this present age will be memorialised. If that can be appropriate. I'd probably argue that since we know quite clearly that the coronavirus affects people disproportionately who are poorer and who are in badly paid jobs, then I think I'd rather memorialise it by ending badly paid jobs and ending poverty. I think that would probably be a big aim, but something that we could put our efforts towards. But certainly more top quality public facilities and parks and kind of opportunities for people would be the best lasting monument, so that people can play just like the kids behind me and have rich and rewarding lives.